JPEGs.com. Shooting with exposed to the right approach often means that you need to increase the camera exposure by a stop or even 2 stops. And here we're going to look at what that means for the histograms and JPEGs at ISO 100 versus ISO 50 on the Sony A7R 5. I've laid up the 2 histograms side by side here. Let's pull them up. Well, maybe not. That's better that way. And on the left is ISO 100, and on the right is ISO 50. Now, you might notice that the shutter time and aperture are identical on the left and the right. So these exposures are actually identical exposures. The only difference is the ISO value. The only difference as far as the configuration. And I've confirmed that the raw digger files are solid up to somewhere around here at, let's see, 1 stop, 2 stops, 2 1/3, up to half a second. We actually have a good exposure. So let's go over these. So this exposure here is the metered exposure by the camera. It's what the camera thought at ISO 100 was the correct exposure, and we can see there's this big gap between the right side of the values, where the histogram values fall off here, to the right side. So it's quite a bit underexposed. How much? Well, the camera doesn't give you good tools for that. So let's give another third. That's 1 stop more than the camera metered and exposed at. At that point, you can still see there's room to go at ISO 100. And same exposure at ISO 50, you can still see there's a lot of room to go. So let's keep going. Another third of a stop. Now this ISO 100 shot looks like it's right at the edge of what you could possibly expose at without losing it. That's 1.3 stops more, 1.3 stops more than the camera wanted to meter by default. Keep going. Now we see the ISO 100 is jammed up against the right. That's 1.7 stops higher. Normally you'd say that's going to blow out and you don't want this, you wouldn't want to go this far. But if we look over at ISO 50, same exposure, we can see there's still lots of room to go to the right side. And we can keep going. We're here going. Now that one's probably shot. Look at now the ISO 50 is jammed up against the right. And in fact, that one is too hot, too exposed. But we can back off to this one, the half-second exposure, and look at what we got. There are 2 key things to notice here. If you're an ETTR shooter, you want the best possible exposure. That means the brightest one. And there are 2 huge downsides to using ISO 100. On the left, we can see the ISO 100 is the JPEG is not only blown out, that gray stuff is the blinking highlights business. It's blinking like crazy, telling you that you've absolutely blown it. This thing is gone. And the histogram reflects that too. It's all jammed up against the right. But is that actually true? This is the half-second exposure, right? Well, look at the ISO 50 one. There's no blinking, no blown highlights. We've got a JPEG we can actually use if we want to magnify and check focus or check anything. We can use this JPEG. This one is a disaster. It's completely unusable in the camera for reviewing the image. It scares us because it looks blown. All the details gone in places we might want to look. But this one at ISO 50, exactly the same exposure, half second at f5.6. We get a nice looking JPEG, and we get a histogram that accurately reflects where things are, meaning it's not exactly right, but it's the closest thing we're going to get to the actual raw digger histogram for the optimal exposure. And let's take a look at that. We've gone to go down to raw digger here, and this is the half-second exposure. You can see I've got the histograms laid up here, and over in the raw digger histogram, you can see the green has been pushed all the way to the right, the tiny little spike here, but basically it has not gone past the capabilities of the sensor. So that's our optimal exposure, which I also confirmed by checking the actual processed files. No difference at 2.3 stops brighter capture than metered. That's a crazy amount extra of exposure, and there's no blowout here, and that's confirmed with the final images, not just histograms, but the final images. So that's what our histogram and raw digger is telling us. And that's what we had back here in our side-by-side comparison. Half a second at f5.6, the camera was telling us that, you know, it's not exactly the same as the raw digger, but it's pretty darn good in being, you know, consistent with the raw digger thing. So my conclusion here is that if you shoot at ISO 50, if you're an ETTR shooter shooting in RAW, if you shoot at ISO 50 and you shoot, say, RAW plus JPEG, you'll not only get a good quality review JPEG or embedded JPEG if you just shoot RAW, that's still a JPEG. You won't get this, you'll get this, which you can review and peruse on the camera. And you will get this histogram, which accurately reflects what's actually in the RAW file. So as an ETTR shooter, this is your best tool, at least on the Sony, for gauging how much exposure to give it and what you've really got in that capture. You know, if you're nervous, you can back it off a little bit, right? This histogram is really, I would back off on this and go to here. But if you want to really play it safe, you go to here. Either of those is way better than way back there, which was, you know, really, really underexposed quite a bit. So that's your tip for getting good ETTR exposures. See also my video on the setting the zebra pattern to identify where you're going to get blowout, so that you can actually, well, let's just take a quick look at that on the configuring zebra display. If you configure zebra at ISO 50 to a level of 100, it turns out that will be the point at which it will start to manifest a zebra pattern on bright things. You can see there's a little edge stuff starting here. 1/3 more stop past that and it will go zebra on you. If you rely on that feature, the zebra at 100, you can get that perfect exposure, and then you can also confirm it, or get back to there. You can also go back, you can rely on the zebra, and then you can also check the histogram at ISO 50 like this, not ISO 100. That's not going to let you, that's going to go drive you crazy. So if you've got the zebra not showing, you've just backed it off from where zebra starts, and you check the histogram, the chances of blowing exposure are very, very low. And if you get a little nervous, well, heck, just back off from here to here, 1/3 of a stop. You're not going to have any appreciable loss of quality, and you're still, you know, 2 stops here, more exposure than you were at the camera's metered exposure. Two whole stops. That's a lot for the ETTR shooter.